So here we are in Lino, Bartholomew Close, in the City of London. I'm sat here with author of Stolen, How to Save the World from Financialisation, Grace Blakeley. Grace, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me on.
I wouldn't have thought that you would choose to spend any leisure time whatsoever in the City of London. What accounts for this choice?
I mean, in many ways, this is kind of the best place for me to be, I think. Obviously, my book is about financialisation, so it's about not just the kind of expansion in the size of our finance sector and the size of the city, but the way in which the logic that is generated here, which I call kind of financialisation, has impacted other areas of the economy.
Thank you.
Thanks. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's really important for us to understand and centre, because so often, we overlook or understate the importance of kind of finance and impacting the rest of the economy. I think it's important for us to actually realise the extent to which this place has had a significant impact on the history of British capitalism, basically. And that's, I think too often on the left, we kind of shy away from centering a villain in the story. We're very keen to kind of just talk about how nice everything would be if we could all just work together. But actually, we need to be able to explain why things aren't working in the economy. And I think a big part of that is actually looking to the centre of power and the centre of wealth in this country, which is here.
So in terms of location, then obviously great product placement for the book.
Exactly.
And,
that's another
and very
reason.
much on point. You recently toured your book in the US. How did that go? Were you surprised
amazing.
by any of the reactions to it?
Was I surprised? Yes, in a way, because it talks quite substantially about British capitalism. And I was kind of mainly talking to groups like the Democratic Socialists of America, like Jacobin, kind of groups on the left in the US. And I was surprised at the extent to which those who had read it and people listening to the discussions were willing and kind of seeking to draw lessons from the British experience that could be applied to America. So I think the kind of distinctive thing there is that, the argument of my book is that we had this kind of moment in the 1970s where during that kind of period of crisis, there was this choice that we were faced with, basically, which was, well, we kind of going to go more towards the socialist route advocated by people like Tony Benn, or we're going to go for kind of full-throated finance-led neoliberalism. Obviously, we ended up going for the latter. And that battle that took place during that time provides unique lessons for our time, for the period since the financial crisis, and for socialists all over the world. And I think those in the US were very keen because they don't really have that history of a socialist movement, were quite, I don't know, they found it useful to think about the ways in which these two groups have historically kind of fought against each other, even if the kind of presence of the socialist left has been less obvious in the US, and how that can allow them to learn things about how to push back during this very particular moment where you're seeing socialists resurgent in the US.
Do you remember where you were 10 years ago when news of the collapse of Lehman Brothers came out?
I would have been 15. I don't 100% remember, to be honest. I wish I did. The thing that I really remember during my childhood, and especially, at times I was kind of studying history and economics, so it kind of vaguely came out to me, was that I always remember on the TV, kind of before the financial crisis, there were constantly on the kids shows or teen shows I was watching, there were constantly adverts for release the equity from your home, have you got bad credit, remortgage, whatever. I knew what a CCJ was by the time I was 15, because it was constantly on these adverts saying, have you got bad credit, you can remortgage or get a credit card with us. And I remember thinking that was weird because I think it had changed a little bit and they'd become more prominent. And it's only looking back on that now that I think, okay, this was such a significant part of that pre-crisis period, that consumer debt-driven growth model where people were literally taking on debt and after debt and releasing the equity from their homes to finance consumption, and that this was driving this incredible boom that we can now look back on and realize that, wow, that was obviously completely unsustainable. But in many ways, we've failed to learn any of those lessons, and you're seeing, in some senses, the re-emergence of those dynamics today.
Yes, yeah, and so I suppose you would have also remembered, as I do, because there's a few years between us. I think you must be 6 years younger.
Yeah, I'm 26.
Right, so 31, and then you must have remembered seeing the adverts subsequent to the financial crisis of send in your gold.
Yes.
Any gold goods.
Yeah, I do.
I remember that in particular, and wondering, what is the deal with gold before I really understood commodities.
Yeah. No, that was, no, you're right. That's totally fascinating. I do remember that. And it was obviously, during any crisis, those very, very safe assets massively spike in value. And I think we're seeing that to a small extent at the moment, because obviously there's a widespread sense that we're going to be going into another another economic downturn, if not another financial crisis at some point in the next couple of years. So, yeah.
So you're being whisked away after this interview up to Canterbury,
yes.
right? So tell us more about what you're going to be up to there today, since we'd be remiss not to talk about the coming election.
Yeah, so I will be up there campaigning. Canterbury was obviously one of those seats that was completely unexpected win for Labour in 2017, partly on the back of the kind of, massive change in the way that young people were voting, and that were turning out more and disproportionately voting for Labour. And I think that's very much linked to the experience of young people since the financial crisis, since basically financial capitalism broke down and was no longer able to provide the same increasing living standards, hope for the future that had been provided to our parents. Young people since the financial crisis have basically, had a decade of wage stagnation and can't afford to buy their own homes.
Yeah, it's actually quite hard being the son or daughter of a middle earner that benefited from Thatcher's capitalism, where you want to suggest that the collapse was not just a punctuation mark in an otherwise complete sentence. It's actually the full stop. It's a moment where we really need to take stock.
That's a really good way of putting it, yeah.
It's difficult, though, to sell that to a generation who really feel that all was going well, and they're not quite sure what went wrong.
Yeah.
But they also know that what they have, they've worked hard for, and they don't want to let go of it. That presents such a huge challenge, and it will obviously in the coming election as well. I mean, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah,
the generational gap.
I couldn't have put it better myself, to be honest. I think that's really true, that there's this idea called the paradox of thrift, which is that when people see the value of their assets go up in a bubble, they presume that it's because of their own hard work and savings, right? Whereas actually it's just, they're caught up in this economic model. And for most people who are able to kind of get on the train, I suppose, of rising house prices, rising stock prices because of their pension funds, at the very beginning of the Thatcherite revolution, they saw the value of their assets skyrocket. And sure, they fell a bit after the financial crisis. And for those who got on the ladder towards the latter end of that boom, that was significant. But, you might have seen your house, if you bought a house outside of London in the outskirts of London in the 1980s, you would have seen that increase in price, like 3, 4, 5 times. And you would have assumed that, if I could have done it, then why can't young people do it? And then you get these narratives of, it's because they're spending too much money on avocado on toast, they're lazy, they don't kind of, work the way that we did. Whereas actually, getting that generation to understand that what they lived through was an historically unprecedented, perhaps other than, the point before the Wall Street crash, moment in the history of capitalism, where asset prices just boomed because of all this debt that was being created. It was always completely unsustainable. And now we're living in the aftermath of that. My parents kind of get it now because they've read my book and they're like, oh, actually, yeah, that's a really good point. But, and I think it encourages them to think very differently about the challenges that young people face. So I think, you're right, getting that message across is important. But it's also important to speak to older people in the language of their interests as well. Because a lot of people,
yes.
a lot of older people kind of have this money stored up in their home and they think, oh, that's set aside for my retirement, I'm going to be fine. But actually, their pension funds, they've probably got a deficit because we're living through a pensions crisis where most pension funds don't have the capacity to meet their liabilities. The state pension is very low. And many of these people will have to end up selling their homes to pay for end-of-life care because social care is completely not working in this country. So there are also very good reasons to speak to these people, that the left, very good ways the left can speak to these people and say your interests actually are not just with a continuation of the status quo.
So this is perhaps the book that all young people can buy for their parents for Christmas.
That is a really good marketing strategy.
If there's any sort of need to reconcile family differences post-election. So looking at this menu, what takes your fancy?
That is a good question.
I think I'll have the bavette steak sandwich.
You've had longer than me to be able to decide. I'm going to have to go just.
It's okay,
go off
no
the
pressure.
bat.
This isn't live radio.
The steak sandwich does look good. Yeah.
2 steak sandwiches. You paraphrase Gramsci, calling what we're living through right now the interregnum, the place between the death of an old world and the birth of the new, the crossroads, as you put it, between extinction and utopia. Explain that, if you will.
Yeah, so I mean, the argument in the book, as I kind of alluded to, is that, every model of capitalism has its own internal problems and contradictions that kind of prevent it from working as well as it once did as time goes on. So you can look at the financial crisis and look at how that was rooted in a model that was created in the 1980s based on private home ownership, based on the deregulation of finance that led to a massive increase in private debt, privatization of various collectively owned assets, the kind of withdrawal of the state from providing certain things to people, and that all culminated in this big financial crisis based on individual consumption, high levels of debt, and a state that wasn't really there to kind of regulate that model or step in when things got bad. And those contradictions were rooted in the kind of economy that Thatcher created in the 1980s. And the reason that she was able to create that economy was because the old one during the 1970s had broken down as a result of its internal contradictions. And this was obviously the kind of post-war consensus model of, the state was more actively stepping in to really alleviate unemployment. It was working with unions and companies to kind of determine pay and who got what from economic growth. And that model kind of worked for a while because it soothed class tensions. It soothed tensions between those who owned the stuff and those who worked for a living, but it didn't completely eliminate them. And then when in the 1970s you got the oil price spike, you got kind of falling profits, then suddenly those like tensions between labour and capital, people who live off work and live off wealth, exploded. And you had industrial action, you had economic turmoil, stagflation, etc. And so those contradictions were inherent in that model as well. And basically, if you look at any way that capitalism is organized, the same sort of thing happens. You get 30 years of growth or stability, followed by a 10, 15-year period of crisis, followed by the emergence of a new economic model. And I'm arguing that today we're living in one of those periods where the old model's broken down, we aren't quite sure what's going to come next. And those moments are always moments of political polarization as well as kind of economic turmoil, because suddenly the parties that say things should broadly stay as they are, we just need to tweak things around the edges, are decimated. Whereas those on the kind of extreme ends who say we need to go this direction or that direction, that makes much more sense to people when the status quo isn't working, which is why you're seeing the Conservatives go off this way and say we need to kind of break with Europe and tilt towards the rest of the world and kick out the immigrants and whatever. And those on the left saying we need to basically move towards a model of democratic socialism that hands power back to people in their communities and their workplaces. So they're very, very different models of the future.
Is it the case, though, that one always wins, or that, as a lot of people argue and hope, in fact, there is a compromise ultimately?
I think during these moments, these historical moments are not moments of compromise, in my opinion. So I think that, that we have two choices. You can't smush together a bit of socialism and a bit of far-right extremism, right? I mean, you can try, but it probably won't remain stable for very long. I think, we have to choose a model, and then when that model is chosen, that's when you start making the compromises. It's a similar sort of thing with Thatcherism and Blairism, right? Thatcher determined the model. Blair then accepted that and said, we're going to change it a little bit by making it less unequal and da-da-da-da-da. Or, in the post-war period, the Attlee model. The Conservatives accepted the existence of the NHS, even though they'd fought it to begin with, and just changed it a bit, right? I think, there is room, there's obviously always room in politics for compromise, but there are some points at which you have to make a decision about what kind of society you want to live in, what kind of economy you want to live in. I think we're at one of those points right now.
One assumption that both socialism and capitalism make is that human beings all want the same things. For capitalism's part, it assumes primarily that we all want to own the same things most of the time. How feasible is it that a consumer society such as ours, that has defined prosperity as the ability to afford nice new things, switch suddenly to having less of what is nice and new, but more of what is essential? It's quite a hard sell to the British public post-Thatcher, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that, again, is a really, really good way of putting it. And I think in many ways, people understand this intuitively. Because if you go to most parts of the country, people know that another nice TV isn't going to make them happy, isn't going to deal with the fact that they are lonely and isolated, working way too hard for not enough pay, that their sense of community has been destroyed. They probably don't know their neighbours. They probably don't really have a sense of, of place, of rootedness. And that is generating all sorts of kind of political and psychological ailments that can't be fixed by just going out and buying new stuff. I think speaking to that, the alienation created by the Thatcherite ideology of you are defined by what you can consume and the fact that that's reached its peak, as well as the fact that there are an increasing number of people that cannot afford to consume the things they need to kind of acquire the identities that they would like to acquire, leads to the situation we're in now, which is where most people are probably crying out more for a sense of solidarity, a sense of community, a sense of belonging than they are for like nice new stuff. But it is a question of how we articulate that, because often the right can use that feeling to say, well, the problem is just that, you know, there's all these brown people living here that you don't know, right? Which is obviously not why they, you know, these places feel this way. I think the archetypal example is what happened to mining communities after Thatcherism. You know, they were built on this sense of solidity, of solidarity, of community, and the destruction of those industries, the destruction of those places completely tore that apart. And that has to do with changes to the economy, with the centralization of our economy, with the financialization of our economy, not anything really to do with, like, you know, other people coming in. There are examples of communities all around the country where that are diverse and people have a sense of belonging to a we that is not defined by race or whatever. So I think it's important for the left actually to start making these arguments, which are maybe not as familiar to people who come from a very intellectual tradition, but are actually, rooted in people's everyday experiences.
You write about the neoclassical economists who failed to predict the financial crisis, partly because the crisis wasn't just about economic policy, but because they believed the logic behind the Great Moderation period that you can explain in a moment of high interest, low inflation was the answer to instability for the long term. Why did they get this so wrong?
I think it was partly to do with a kind of hubris, right? It was partly just a sense that that central bank independence in particular had generated the conditions that we were living through, which broadly seemed to be kind of increasing prosperity. It was also a failure to look at the right things. So because of the way that economists after the kind of neoclassical revolution sought to understand the economy, they focused on top-line indicators that we're all used to hearing about, so inflation, GDP, employment, etc. What they weren't looking at was financial markets or the banking system. And that's because they broadly thought that financial markets were efficient. They didn't think really that bubbles could emerge, or if they did, that they wouldn't cause as many problems as if the government tried to regulate them, and because they didn't really have a kind of a theory of money and finance that really explained what went on in the banking system. So all that meant that, you know, they were just focusing on inflation. And the thing is, you can get a really big bubble in house prices, in the price of a particular asset, without it particularly impacting in the same way consumer prices. So the only really way to deal with that is to kind of try and, you know, use particular kinds of policies that are linked to the financial cycle, kind of what are called macroprudential policies. And whereas, you know, we were very focused on just using monetary policy, using interest rates to control inflation. And that was part of the reason that we got the bubble emerging in the first place, and obviously a big significant factor behind the financial crisis. So the fact that economists thought they had tamed the financial cycle actually ended up making the bubble that they were living through even worse.
One thing that some particular neoclassical economist said, Robert Solow, something to the effect that it wasn't necessarily that the theory was proven, but that the facts just happened to validate the theory.
Yeah.
That's incredible, isn't it?
No, because economists don't build models with reference to empirical facts.
True, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they build models with a reference to assumptions about the world. And then they say, it doesn't matter about the assumptions, as long as the end result broadly reflects reality, then the model must work. And yeah, I mean, you know, this is still, neoclassical economics was really like properly hegemonic before the financial crisis. Less so today, although it's still very dominant, but its dominance is being challenged, which means that, you know, more historical schools of economics like institutional economics, and more kind of empirical schools of economics that do try and build theory with reference to fact are becoming more mainstream. But, you know, the neoclassical economists still hold the ball, so that's a problem.
Okay, so it's been a crutch for the Conservative Party for the last decade to say that Labour effectively caused the financial crash. And reading your book, you give reasons why fiscal policy under New Labour certainly did tend to, if not sow the seeds within that soil. But is it fair to say that Labour under Blair and Brown essentially hoodwinked the country into thinking that they were doing something different to Thatcherism?
I think, yeah, probably to begin with. Yeah, because I think probably people did buy into that to begin with, that there was a sense of hope that things would be different after, the massive increases in inequality and the kind of breakdown of society that you'd seen under Thatcher. And yeah, as you said, with fiscal policy, they did try and do that. There was more redistribution, there were kind of higher taxes, but there wasn't really a fundamental change to the way that the economy worked. And it was really when it came to the management of the finance sector that they did help to sow the seeds of the financial crisis, although it is worth bearing in mind that they only exacerbated the problems that had been created by Thatcherism.
Right.
Basically, by accepting the terrain of Thatcherism, they allowed the crisis to happen. And the economy was handed over to New Labour at the point at which that cycle was reaching its least stable phase. So in many ways, there was very little that could have been done, towards the end of the New Labour period, at least. But yeah, I mean, the way in which New Labour tried to regulate the finance sector, which was basically to hand power over to kind of, in inverted commas, neutral bodies, basically facilitated the kind of regulatory capture that did help to create the financial crisis, because, these bodies were increasingly dominated by people who had worked in the city, people who were going to work in the city, and, people who had lots of connections in the city. So they didn't really have the incentives to properly regulate these places, accompanied by the fact that there was this explicit shift towards light touch regulation, which is basically, if it hasn't been said it's illegal, then you're probably fine. Mm-hmm. And this is and obviously, the seeds of the financial crisis were ultimately sown in the US subprime mortgage market. But the economic model that we had in the UK was also not particularly stable in and of itself. And we would have likely had another crisis of the kind that we had in the early 1990s at some point, even if we hadn't had the US subprime crisis. So there are a lot of very complicated things going on, but it's not fair to say that Labour caused the financial crisis, but it is fair to say that the dominant way of thinking about the economy that existed at that time did not help things.
The American economist Hyman Minsky also gets a hearing in your book about the role of human psychology in capitalism's tendency to derail. This seemed to me to be particularly salient. I want us to explore that further. If we accept that no system is perfect, but that all systems are governed by the psychology of groups and individuals, what's to stop human psychology from unearthing equally destabilizing features of socialism? Do you ever worry about that?
Yeah, in a way. I mean, I'm sure that no matter what economic model we had, there would be certain problems with it. The unique thing about the problems that emerge under capitalist societies is that they're always driven by conflict between classes. Mm-hmm. So every capitalist system, is based on an attempt to mute or disguise class conflict in one way or another. Under Thatcherism, it was give everyone a house and there'll be many capitalists. Under the post-war consensus, it was the state will play a role in mediating between these two groups. But ultimately, that conflict ends up spilling out and creating problems. Under socialism, that wouldn't be an issue, because the idea would be to move towards a system where these big class divisions between these two groups just didn't exist anymore, because things were all owned collectively. There wasn't this distinction between people who live off work and those who live off wealth. Everyone works, everyone owns. We all decide together how the economy is going to work. But that's not to say that there wouldn't be other problems. That's not to say that we wouldn't to collectively decide to do the wrong things, right? But I would feel like it is more empowering and more kind of attuned to the problems that we face at the moment to have a system of decision making and to have an economy that is driven by collective discussion and consensus than it is just to hand power and wealth to the people at the top and say, make all the decisions and do what you like with it. Because, if we're going to solve climate change, we need to all be able to push back against that model of just profit maximization and say that we need something more rational.
Some of the glimpses we get of socialism in action around the world are very attractive, others less so, and it often depends on where in the world you choose to take as an example. Is there a system that you think sufficiently proves socialism already works? Or does socialism ultimately require full global alignment in order to work?
I think over the long term, it does. But over the short term, I think there are ways that different countries can kind of experiment with different things. I don't actually think that there is a place at the moment that completely captures everything that, makes democratic socialism. There are lots of social democracies, and they obviously kind of fare better than the kind of neoliberal model that we've constructed, but they're increasingly being eroded by the same sorts of, issues that have emerged in our society, particularly like, mobility of capital makes it harder to tax and spend in the way that would be kind of optimal under social democratic systems. That kind of the changes to the economy and society that result from that particular form of globalization often generate kind of a nativist reaction that, again, undermines those institutions. I think we're seeing that in a lot of the Nordic countries at the moment as well. So really, I think of this kind of experiment as similar to what you could have imagined the transition from capitalism to feudalism, or even, on a smaller level, kind of a more extractive form of laissez-faire capitalism to social democratic capitalism. It's something that you can see pieces of everywhere, whether that's in socialized healthcare systems or community organizing or social housing, but it's not emerged in itself as in its entirety anywhere. And I think, that's in many ways a cause for hope, because we obviously haven't discovered the perfect way of organizing the economy, organizing society. But why should that mean that we suddenly stop at this point thinking about new ways to, organize humanity? We know that different kinds of people emerge under different kinds of systems. We know that human nature is malleable. We know that, the way the world works isn't set in stone. So why have we suddenly decided collectively that things cannot be any better? It seems like a massive failure of our collective imagination, and one that suits very much the people who benefit from the current system.
There's so much that we can't cover here. So I would just like to ask you, if you could speak to somebody who has just come of age in order to vote, how would you advise them to think about this coming election?
I think I would say... there's a load of things I could say about climate change, about fixing the economy, about, tuition fees, about university. But more than anything, I think, now is the chance we have to defeat this ideology of capitalist realism, which is that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. We're facing a very stark choice between a kind of Boris Johnson style dystopia with, the UK as a tax haven off the coast of Europe, a failure to tackle climate change, massive constraints on migration and all these different things, or an experiment that, yes, is that we haven't tried before and so is uncertain, but actually that we know if we can work together and try and imagine and create a different way of organising the world. And that's really what this project is based on. It's not, Corbyn. It's actually 500,000 people joining the Labour Party and saying we want to build a different kind of society and we're going to knock on doors to do that. That's where I think the real hope and opportunity is coming in this election. It's basically the chance for us as individuals to realise that we can work together to do things differently.
I hope I haven't kept you from enjoying your lunch.
Not at all.
Thank you very much for joining me, Grace.
Thank you so much. Thanks.